All right, students, welcome to Chapter 28. We're going to start today with 28.1, the Cold War during the 1960s. We're going to go over the Kennedy administration first here, just to start off, and some of the early stages of the 1960s events that lead to the, but the continuation of the Cold War. So let's start right off here. We're going to look at the Kennedy administration. Now, he is the youngest elected president, not to discount the vice president that took over after an assassination, Mr. Roosevelt, but he's the youngest elected president. Now, the 1960 election is quite fascinating when you really look at it, because there's a lot of different factors where you have Kennedy, who almost arises out of nowhere to take the Democratic nomination, and then he faces off against Nixon, who is Eisenhower's longtime vice president. Nixon, when it comes to experience, categorically was probably the better choice out of the two. He'd already dealt with Khrushchev. He's already had experience debating the man, and he was also known as pretty much a hardliner, where he wasn't going to deal with Soviet posturing. So Nixon looked like the ideal candidate for the Republicans. However, this was the very first presidential election where there was television debates. And when there was debates between Kennedy and Nixon, Kennedy came out ahead. He looked better than Nixon on television, and he also presented himself a lot better than Nixon possibly could too. There's the kind of old joke, if you see it from television and cartoons and things like that, where Nixon and Kennedy are debating and Nixon's over there sweating like insanely and Kennedy's perfectly in line and hair is perfect. That's kind of the image that people remember or remember seeing. However, Kennedy does get elected, and what he does, a lot different from historical presidencies that have established and built their cabinets, instead of bringing on traditional long-term government employees, he really tries to branch out and find people like Robert McNamara, who becomes in charge of the Defense Department, who are innovative and they've worked in the private sector. He tries to bring in what he calls his brain trust, these young, invigorated minds that look at government differently comparative to people who had been staunchly entrenched in the government for a very long time. So they come up with inventive solutions whenever they're looking at these more complicated diplomatic issues that start to arise during Kennedy's administration. Now, admittedly, Kennedy does face a lot of problems with the Soviet Union in his brief presidency. And we're going to cover a couple of the big ones, okay? But first off, before we get there, Kennedy decides to move away from Eisenhower's plan of we're going to keep a small military for the most part, but we're going to keep advanced weapons, and if it comes down to war, you know what? We're just going to nuke the Soviets. That's kind of how Eisenhower viewed it. But Kennedy, he wanted to be a little bit more flexible, more adaptable. So he creates something that's known as the three-part flexible response. And so the very first one is yes, he still wants to keep nuclear weapons on the table. However, he wants to improve and adapt the nuclear arsenal to be more flexible and deployable. So we're talking about moving, we're looking at putting land-based missiles within the United States that have longer ranges, that can be better protected within the heartland of the United States, and then shoot those up and over the top of the North Pole to hit the Soviet Union. He wants to improve those missiles. And then also he wants to improve and grow bombers. This is where you start to see the development of bombers such as the B-52, which is now a big, large, long-range bomber that they can have circle around and near the Soviet Union for continuous amounts of time and can carry a pretty substantial bomb load. Also, he wanted more nuclear submarines, and when we mean nuclear submarines, we mean both perspectives, nuclear-powered but also carrying nuclear weapons. with a nuclear submarine, it can stay underwater, and in a modern environment, they can stay underwater for up to 6 months without it needing to resurface. And then usually you can park a nuclear submarine off the coast of another country and be able to hit it within 5 to 10 minutes comparative to the 30 minutes it takes when you launch an ICBM from your home country. So he wants to be able to deploy those. And one of the key points to that is the smaller warheads, so that you can put a missile onto a submarine and have a high-yield nuclear weapon yet in a smaller package. So he really looks at updating and improving America's nuclear arsenal. Now, admittedly, we're not going to really cover this, but it's something to kind of consider here. He also enters into negotiations near the end of his presidency with the Soviet Union to try to reduce nuclear arsenals too. So he was not a staunch nuclear first kind of guy. Instead, and there's a couple reasons behind this when we get into a little bit of the foreign policy issues where he starts to really move away from nuclear weapons. We'll cover that shortly. So part 2 of his response was he wanted to improve the United States military equipment. So again, remember, we're moving away strictly from nuclear first policies. So he starts to build more tanks, more airplanes, more helicopters. The helicopter is going to play a very key critical role in the Vietnam War. So learning about helicopters now is important later on. But also, these are weaponry, though, that he can run a conventional war with. One of the things that they look at is the war in Korea, and they realize that there's a little bit of lack of updated material that the United States could be utilizing in order to better engage in these third world hotspots. And also they could use that equipment and sell it to the third world too. So we're looking at a two-pronged approach: better equipment for American troops and entering into the arms game and being able to sell it to the third world. So 2 of those. And one of the things that this really kicks off, though, is that it really ignites a weapons race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, American economics are stronger than the Soviets, so the Soviets have to pull money away from like agricultural projects because it's a state-sponsored program instead of coming from the private sector, like in the United States, where we take bids and we have companies come to us with designs and then we decide to produce or manufacture them. The Soviet Union has to commit all of its resources up front from their direct economy. And so what this does is it leaves money neglected for farming, and so therefore you start to see food shortages in the Soviet Union. And this is a constant problem throughout the history of the Soviet Union, is lack of food, because long-term planning, we find out from a government perspective, typically does not work when trying to meet the needs to feed your country. All right. Their third part is, of course, supporting the third world. So they look at arming the third world and backing usually people who are backing people who are not communists, but often backing dictators who expressly say, well, we'll never go communist, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be a really great, nice guy and hold democratic elections. Often down in South America, we kind of back these despots who say that they're not communists and that they'll fight communists. And one of the things that we supply them with is weaponry. Now, the third world, what it really needed and still needs today is economic development. They didn't really need guns and bombs. What they needed was investment from like the International Monetary Fund and also from American businesses. And this would have helped them out a lot more than us being like, here, we're here to help. Here's some guns and bullets, and this dictator, he'll take care of you. At least you're not under communism. That's kind of the idea behind this one, though. I mean, of course, we did want to support democratic countries and democratic governments, but often when we're talking about some of these regions, we would be backing people that may not have been any better than communists at times. Okay, so one of the things, though, that starts to hamper early on with Kennedy is what occurs in Cuba in the late 1950s. Now, admittedly, this happens underneath Eisenhower. However, Cuba becomes a massive thorn in the side of Kennedy. So in the 1950s, remember that idea and policy of backing the third world governments and often dictators being in place? Well, this happened. And this happened because we were backing Batista's government, and Batista was basically nothing more than a dictator. He allowed illegal casinos to operate, well, not really illegal since he was allowing them to happen, but they were illicit down in his home country. And this actually drew a lot of wealthy Americans and even Hollywood celebrities to go down to Cuba and engage and gamble and enjoy the resort-style life that was based in Cuba. Now, eventually, when you have somebody who's basically a corrupt dictator, it does tend to rise up revolutionary thoughts and ideas. And Fidel Castro decides that he's had enough, and he gets together with his friends, and they go ahead and overthrow the Batista government. And so, once that falls apart, initially Fidel Castro says, "Oh, don't worry, I'm a nationalist. I'm just here to free Cuba from an evil dictator." And then he turns right around and goes, "Oh, hey, by the way, I'm a Marxist. Soviet Union, would you like to give us some money?" And so the United States suddenly realizes that now they have a communist state sitting about 90 miles off their coast. So they start to think of different ways of how do we depose Fidel Castro. And they start coming up with some pretty weird and crazy ideas, up to and including hire mafia hitmen to go down and kill Fidel Castro. But one of the things, though, that Eisenhower comes up with and starts to do before he ends his presidency is he starts to train some Cuban dissidents, people who had fled Cuba and wanted to go ahead and try to kick Fidel Castro out of the office. And one reason why, though, this creates so many problems for the United States with Castro in charge, though, kind of going back here really quickly before I get over to the invasion. But a lot of things that really annoyed him, though, was the fact that there was a lot of American companies that were operating in Cuba, and Fidel Castro started to seize them and then nationalize them. So it basically was taking away corporate assets from American companies. And this, of course, upsets American business owners. They pressure the government to do something about it. We try to pressure Cuba. Cuba just decides to nationalize even more of these companies. And eventually we decide we're going to embargo Cuba. We're not going to trade with them anymore. This embargo is pretty much still, for the most part, in effect today. So Cuba's been embargoed by the United States for a very, very long time. And this has hurt them economically in a lot of ways. For one thing, they can't get updated cars. If you were to go to Cuba, very few people have cars, and what cars they have sometimes are all the way back in design and built in the 1950s, and they're just keeping them up. But they decide that they're going to get in bed with the Soviets, and the Soviets often want something in return. And so we'll go over that one too. We're going to a lot of different places as we go through this. All right, so let's go back, though, to the Cuban dissidents. So we train up a group of Cuban dissidents. The CIA operates the planned invasion. And so we go ahead and we set up what's known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, this again was started under Eisenhower. However, Kennedy, when he shows up, he hears about the plan and he's like, yeah, let's go with it. Now, one of the things, though, that was supposed to happen is when the dissidents landed, the United States, or at least the CIA, was supposed to give some sort of naval support and some aerial support. However, Kennedy kind of gets cold feet right when the invasion happens. So you have about 1,500 men who land on the coast and they're ready to go to war. However, Castro's already heard of this plan. Castro's waiting for them. And without U.S. air support and U.S. naval support, basically the entire invasion falls apart and the Cuban nationals are all captured and either executed or put into prison. It's a massive PR disaster for the Kennedy administration. So this inflames and hurts the U.S. relationships with Cuba, and it forces Cuba even more so in the arms of the Soviet Union, which then the Soviet Union decides to capitalize on it again. So they start giving Castro a lot of money, and he turns around and he takes that money and he uses it to build hospitals and schools. So he tries to use it to improve the lives of Cubans. But furthermore, the Soviets are like, hey, you guys are in a really cool spot, really close to the United States. How about you let us put a couple nuclear weapons over there? And so they do. They go ahead and they start to establish some missile launching facilities. And the Soviet Union moves right past the United States and starts to smuggle in the nuclear weapons systems that would need to be put in place. And this really frightens the United States when we finally find out about it with some U-2 spy flyovers. And this really looks at it and we go, man alive, If this happens, they can launch a missile and hit anywhere in the United States in less than 15 minutes. We would not have an early warning if they decide to hit right into Miami. So Kennedy, he goes on television, he tells everybody what's going on. The Soviets are putting missiles in Cuba. We're not going to stand for it. Also, there's a confrontation over in the United Nations, too, where they start showing on the maps and like, hey, look, they're lying, saying they're not putting missiles there, but look, we can prove that they're putting missiles there. So it was kind of a black eye moment for the Soviet Union when they were trying to deny it in the UN also. Now, Kennedy and Khrushchev, they both enter into a letter writing campaign where they write letters and have them passed back and forth between diplomats to try to solve this problem. And one of the things, though, that Kennedy says is, you know what, I'm going to put my Navy out on the ocean. And if any of your ships try to come in, we're going to stop them and we're going to search them. And the Soviet Union says if you do that, that's going to start a war and it's going to go nuclear. So this turns into one of the longest 6 days in human history. And so we sit back, and as we're sitting there, the world's on the brink. It really is. I mean, if the United States stop these ships and search them, there's a very good chance that they could use those nuclear missiles in Cuba, and then we'd use ours in Turkey, and there'd be a nuclear war across the board. However, when push came to shove, and they passed their final letter to each other, Khrushchev basically says, all right, we blink. We'll turn our ships around. You don't have to search them, and we'll dismantle the nuclear facilities on Cuba. And later on, they come to an agreement for the United States to also remove their nuclear weapons from Turkey. However, that's a very clandestine and quiet operation comparative to the very large black eye that Khrushchev takes also when he fails to intimidate Kennedy. Now, again, the Soviets, though, keep pushing during this time frame. And one of the other things that they push at is they push in Germany. So when they start pushing in Germany, what's happening is that all the skilled workers over in East Germany look at West Germany and they go, it's a lot nicer over there. They got a lot more freedoms. And you know what? I have a skill set. I have jobs. I can make my way over there. So they start to leave and they start to jump out of East Germany and into West Germany. Furthermore, Khrushchev also was like, hey, America, it's time to go. You know, you're sitting in Berlin, which is in the middle of East Germany. You have no business being in here. Time to get out. And Kennedy says, no, we're not really going to leave. We're just going to stay here. And he starts to put more troops and weapons into West Germany. Fascinating little tidbit in history. Basically, when Khrushchev and the United States were facing off with each other in East and West Germany, both of them had tanks. And Khrushchev literally said in one of his private letters, he said, if the United States had even moved a foot past that line, we would have pulled back. And there would have never been what we know as the Berlin Wall. So what happens is instead of being aggressive, Kennedy's a bit passive. And because of his passivity, what happens is the Soviets decide that they're going to keep their East German citizens in East Germany by building a big massive wall around West Berlin. This becomes known as the Berlin Wall, and it is a monumental structure of about 12 to 15 feet tall in certain places, lined with barbed wire, with machine gun nests, with minefields and tank traps. So the Soviet Union is like, well, we don't want to give the idea that people are trying to escape communism. Let's put a giant evil wall around it and kill people if they try to leave communism. So it's not necessarily a PR victory for the Soviet Union. All right, let's cover one last section here. Well, I think we have two sections. I know this one's a little bit longer, guys. It's covering a lot of really important stuff, though, during the Cold War and during the Kennedy administration. All right, so let's talk about space. The space race really kicks off into high gear under Kennedy. So the Soviets, it looked like the Soviets were winning the space race. Of course, they put up Sputnik first. Second, they put up Yuri Gagarin, if I can say his name right, who was the first man into space by the Soviet Union. Now, when you read about the history, though, of the space race, the Soviets tried to put up between 2 and 3 other astronauts before him when they kind of died. And the Soviet Union usually didn't make it public that they're their cosmonauts were dying when they were going up there when it was unsuccessful. Instead, they would just take the PR victory of, look, we're in space. And then shortly after that, the United States starts to put more men of their own into space. Also, the United States start to put satellites up and like, hey, look, we can put satellites too. And then the Soviets send a satellite around the moon. We're like, come on. So this is why it comes known as the space race, because we're all both trying to outdo each other. So we continue to press forward and we keep trying to put more men up into space. And Kennedy becomes obsessed with going to the moon. That becomes his primary objective. How do we beat the Soviets? Kennedy thinks, and he thinks, we're going to put the first man on the moon. And he starts to invest huge sums of money into NASA, $5 billion a year every year, as Kennedy sets aside and sends it into the NASA budget so we can get there. And this creates a number of different projects that we go through in order to try to get the man to the moon. We have like the Mercury, which is designed to get the first American into space. We're just trying to get somebody up there. So we get somebody up there, and then we move on to our Gemini program, where we try to put Americans into orbit, and we do this multiple times, getting men up there. We get the experience of being able to put men up into space, find out what space has an effect on their bodies, and we can really get scientific studies out of this. We start doing spacewalks where we let men out of the capsule, and they will try to go around in space and get an idea of what it's like floating around. But the Gemini and Mercury missions, they were not without fault like the Soviets, except for ours were public. We had a couple of cases where rockets would blow up on the pad. We had a few where the capsule itself caught on fire and a number of astronauts were killed. So our space program did not go off without a hitch. Instead, there was still people who died in this experimental stages of space flight. Eventually, though, under the Apollo missions, we managed to put our first man on the moon, which is Neil Armstrong. And we do so on July 20th, 1969, and it is broadcast throughout the entire world. People could watch it on television. So this is a very important time, though, when it comes to the development of space. And one of the things, though, that comes about, too, from space exploration is that the United Nations and the countries of Earth decide to get together and say, we're not going to allow space to be weaponized. That is why you do not have space-based nuclear missiles and other things dancing around over your head right now. Instead, you have communication and spy satellites instead. So a couple good things do come out of the space race, aside from just, putting people up there. And you also get a lot of technological advancements that do come about because of the space race. So the space race really changes the nature of humanity. All right, so let's talk about accommodation here. And we're going to try to wrap this up here and try to make this under 25 minutes. Sorry, guys. Okay, so when we look at accommodations, what does Kennedy do to accommodate the Soviets? Well, first off, he pulls out the missiles from Turkey when they pull them out from Cuba. Also, we start to develop more diplomatic relationships to the point that we start selling food, mainly wheat, to the Soviet Union to prevent their people from starving to death. We also start to enter into joint space projects. You're going to see later on in the space race where there are two space capsules that dock together with Soviets and Americans to be able to show that we can work cooperatively. And one last thing that we really work with on the Soviets is a START treaty, which is to reduce the number of nuclear weapons and also to finally ban above ground nuclear testing because it's throwing up way too much radiation into the atmosphere. So there are things that Kennedy does that he tries to work with the Soviets. However, one thing, though, is that he's often not pushing a hard line, and so the Soviets frequently try to push Kennedy. And as you see, a number of times they really try to test him because they're not totally sure if he's strong enough to oppose them. But eventually he does show enough strength, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, to make sure that they do respect him. All right, guys, that ends our first section here, 28.1. Now, 28.2 is going to be broken across about 3 different sections because we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War. And if I was just to sit there and do the entire presentation with you guys, it would probably be an hour and a half, and I don't want to make you guys subjected to that. All right, so I'll see you guys tomorrow. Make sure you do that bell ringer and the homework, and we will see you tomorrow.